Good afternoon again, everybody. Just wanted to let you know that we'll be starting the presentation here in about 2 minutes, letting folks hop on. But again, we should be starting in about 2 minutes, so stay tuned. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's session of the APA New York Upstate Chapter 2020 Virtual Conference, Optimizing Online Public Engagement to Support Your Planning. My name is Bob Murphy. My colleague Trayvon Jackson and I will be your hosts for this session. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our session sponsor for this session, Ingalls Planning and Design. Without our partners, this virtual conference would not be possible. I'd also like to let you know that all sessions as part of this conference are being recorded, and attendees will receive an email link to the recordings once they've been posted. All attendees are automatically muted. If you have any questions, please submit them in the Q&A box. We will address questions after the speaker toward the end of the session. And we'll hope to address your concerns there. If you have any comments, feel free to use the chat box if something is needed to be said. Today's session is presented by Dave Biggs, Chief Engagement Officer at MetroQuest. Dave Biggs is an internationally recognized keynote and panel speaker, author, and public engagement strategist focusing on tools to enhance community participation for planning projects. With over 20 years of experience on a wide range of award-winning projects with government clients and consulting firms, he's built a reputation for leading-edge community outreach. Dave is also honored to serve as an advisor on best practices for public involvement to many planning agencies such as APA, FHWA, and TRB, and public participation organizations such as IAP2 and NCDD. With that, I will turn the session over to Dave.
Thank you so much, and welcome everyone. I just want to confirm that you can see my screen now. Everything looks okay? Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining us today, folks. I'm thrilled to talk to you today about the things that I have learned over the years for optimizing online engagement to support planning. I'm going to just first introduce myself. I'm Dave Biggs. I'm the Chief Engagement Officer at MetroQuest. I'm going to tell a little bit of a story today about how we got here. Just for purposes of the agenda, I'm going to begin by talking about and comparing the reality of public engagement with the goals of public engagement that we all hold. And then I'm going to shift and talk about what we've learned around optimizing the online engagement experience to get the kind of results that we need in order to meet those goals. And I know that many of you online might be looking for online engagement tools. And so I'm going to show you a little bit about MetroQuest to see if that is maybe something that you want to add to your toolbox. But I want to spend most of the time just talking about best practices that to really help you identify how you're going to engage people online in a strategic way, regardless of what platform that you choose to use. And then we'll hopefully have at least 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So get your questions ready and use the question box for those, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. So when it comes to public engagement, and I've been doing this now for about 25 years, there's really two very common outcomes with engaging the public. The first one, the first outcome is really apathy. And so often, and I know that many of you have tried to figure out how you're going to take a picture of your audience to make it look like there was a decent turnout. I've got a whole bunch of these pictures from doing public engagement face-to-face over the years. I have a special pet name for these people. I call them the STP. And for me, that stands for the same 10 people that show up to everything. And you can see that there are indeed 10 people here. This gentleman is one of the consultants. And so there's 10 audience members here. In fact, before COVID hit, the average attendance at a public meeting for a planning process was 9 people. And so if you're suffering from apathy in your public engagement, you're not alone. It's happening across the country. People are, for whatever reason, not able to or not interested in coming to these sessions. The other outcome is you have a fantastic turnout and it's chaos. And oftentimes we'll find that these people are motivated either by anger or fear at whatever is being proposed. And so this is chaos. And I know that we all have our fair share of bruises from sessions like this. I call these people the cave people. And I don't mean that to be derogatory. What I mean by that is they are the citizens against virtually everything. And we all have experiences like this, and I'll get into a little bit about why it is that so many of our public meetings or our public processes, even online, are tainted with people who are either angry or afraid of what they think might be happening. Because of me spending 15 years doing this public engagement work, I personally need therapy. I know many people out there might share that sentiment. Here is indeed a photograph of me up in front of an angry mob. This was one of the last public engagement sessions that I ran before devoting time to creating an online platform to try to solve some of these things that I'm going to talk about. This is me up in front of a well-organized opposition to a planning process that I was responsible for. And this is what I was looking at. There was a whole bunch of cameras. There was a well-organized group that have come out. They positioned themselves at every seat and basically took down the process. What I realized there is there's something very wrong with the types of people that do find their way to these sort of events. We're filtering out a lot of people that have different viewpoints, and we need a process to get more moderate viewpoints and a wide spectrum of views involved in the process. I set about working for the last about 20 years with all kinds of industry associations to try to look across the industry at case studies around public participation to figure out what's working what's not working, and to inevitably create an online platform that tries to be a resource for fixing some of what is happening. As a result of this research, I dove right into it, and I discovered very early on that there's a very interesting correlation between attitude towards whatever planning process is happening and motivation to participate. So regardless of what you're doing out there, there will always be a range of people who are positive, moderate, and negative about whatever is being proposed. It just so happens that where you are on that spectrum dramatically affects your level of motivation for coming and participating in some sort of public engagement, whether it's online or face-to-face. So here's the curve that we discovered. Your level of motivation is relatively high if you're very, very positive, but it's not as high as it could be, because if you're very positive about what's happening, you're not motivated to get off your couch and say, I think you're doing a fantastic job. You're most motivated up here when you are very negative about what's being proposed. And that is why that when there's a high barrier to entry in terms of participating, such as a public workshop or even an online experience that's very long or tedious or involves registration and a bunch of hurdles, the input gathered is primarily negative. It does not represent the full views of the community, but it certainly does represent the negative viewpoints. In order to engage the full cross spectrum of the community, it's important to reduce the barriers to participation as much as possible. And so much of what I'm going to talk about are strategies to reduce the barrier to participation whenever you can. My motivation for creating online platforms and providing this best practice advice is the moment of truth, is that somebody up in front of decision makers making the case that the public's voice has been heard and their ideas are baked into the plan that's being presented. And this is where, no pun intended, the rubber hits the road. So when we look at the scrutiny that these public engagement results get put through, there's essentially a checklist of 4 things that need to be accomplished. The first is you need to demonstrate to decision makers that you have critical mass, that you're oftentimes talking to political people. Numbers matter. So how many people were engaged absolutely matters. Secondly, diversity. Have we heard from a cross-section of the community? Can we identify different demographics and learn what we've gathered from each of those demographics, so decision makers can be assured that their representatives, their public has been heard from and their ideas are baked into the plan. Thirdly, informed input. Can we trust that the information coming in is nuanced, is that the people who are engaged understand the nature of the choices, the trade-offs, the constraints, and all of the complexity around the planning process, or what is the input, can it be criticized as being naive? And lastly, is it quantifiable? When you're talking about engaging thousands of people, it's very, very important to collect quantifiable information so you can graph or map the results in a way that can be visualized in a matter of a few seconds or a minute. So clearly, if you're only collecting text-based comments, it's so difficult and open for criticism to summarize what all of these comments have said. So as a part of your participation, make sure that a great deal of it is quantifiable. So since these experiences that left me bruised, I was involved in a software startup that's now been going for many, many years called MetroQuest. And as a result of that, I have the luxury of having my ear to the ground from planning projects that are happening all across New York State as well as the rest of the country. And so I have a bit of a privileged position to to see what's working well with teams across the country and delivering them in presentations like this. So what have I learned about optimizing for the best results possible, with a particular emphasis on the online experience? So I'm going to talk about those 4 categories that I talked about. The first one is critical mass. So how do you engage thousands of people as opposed to, you know, the same 10 people? And believe me, the same 10 people show up at a lot of online stuff as well. So it's still a problem if you go online. It's not the panacea of if you put it online, thousands of people will come. You have to design the digital experience smartly in order to make it go viral. The first step is think multi-channel. Think about all of the different ways that you can give people options for participating in a way that's comfortable for them. For some people, that will mean laptops and computers. For some people, it will mean mobile. For some people, it will mean a paper-based alternative or a kiosk or a whole bunch of other options for making it available to people in a way that they have quick access to it in a comfortable way. Increasingly, the mobile experience is number 1. So when we look at the demographics of or the share of people that are participating on different devices using MetroQuest, increasingly over 50% of people are using mobile devices. So make sure that that experience is not only doable on a small screen, but delightful on that screen. So you know, that means that you really have to pay close attention to creating that experience, that it's a way that's different from maybe what the desktop or iPad experience might be like. It's so important because of that intimidation factor around sharing your viewpoint to create a safe place where people can participate without fear of being called out for their opinions, even in an open forum kind of environment online, or certainly at a public workshop. If you've got a whole bunch of people shouting around you and you've got a different opinion, you're just going to shut right up. And we see in what's going on with the election right now, how inaccurate polling is. And the reason is the same thing. People are not comfortable sharing their viewpoint for fear of being called out or criticized, or just feeling awkward about it if they feel like their opinion is not a popular opinion. Next, we have a budget, we've learned, and this is a tough one. We have a budget of about 5 minutes of somebody's attention. We have to cram that 5 minutes as full as we can to make the most of that 5 minutes. But if we add a few more questions and we make the survey a little bit longer, just because while we've got your attention, let's ask this as well, we see the participation drop off dramatically. So it's really important to, when you think about if we only have 5 minutes, a lot of the other things that I'm going to talk about are just logical. For example, being very visual and helping people understand things very quickly, and dispensing with anything that needs instructions and so forth, and abandoning most blocks of text and these sort of things, which just drive people away. I can't say enough about, well, I've talked a little bit about getting the digital experience right, but it needs to be paired with promotions. And oftentimes with planning projects, you're dealing with a committee of people that maybe are going to water down or be quite dry about their opinions around promotion. I would encourage you to resist that and try to be fun and a little bit playful with your promotions. Here's an example of a process that I loved in Nashville, where they were engaging people online, and they had these little postcards, and one postcard came out every 2 weeks, and it just shot around the internet. It was about picking the future of Nashville. All right, Nashville, it's time to pick. This little guy came out, and then this little girl came out. And the one that really caught my attention, where the participation in MetroQuest just shot right up, was this last one here. All right, Nashville, it's time to pick. This little girl was, for 2 weeks, she was everywhere, and people were just curious enough to say, pick what, and click on it, and then they take the survey. So can you imagine somebody in the planning department trying to go to their bosses and say, we want to run this campaign, and we have this cute little girl picking her nose. Can we can we use it for promotion? That must have been a fight, right? But it paid off. So have a little bit of fun with them, be lighthearted, but be relatable, and it will pay off dramatically. Now, over the years, since I've been witness to so many of these processes, when we see lots of participation or jumps in the level of participation, all of a sudden, I usually pick up the phone and talk to the clients and say, what just happened? 2 days ago, you just engaged 1,000 people virtually overnight. What happened? What did you do? I have made a guidebook out of the ideas that I have collected based on those conversations. If you would like a copy of that, just shoot me an email. There's my email address, but I'll also have it at the end on the last slide. So happy to share with you what we've learned about promotions. Absolutely key. The next category is diversity. And I can also send you a lot more information around engaging difficult to reach audiences, the environmental justice community, traditionally underrepresented audiences. A few ideas here for brevity. The more visual it can be, the more open it will be to people perhaps that are not as comfortable with language, and obviously making it more visual helps you move quickly. I often say a picture is worth 1,000 words that you can read in 3 seconds. So that's a little add-on. It's really important to keep people moving quickly when you only have 5 minutes. It's so important for diversity to make something that is enjoyable and easy. And one of the reasons is that people will, in dramatically larger numbers, share something that feels fun, easy, and relevant to their lives with their contacts. If you ask somebody to participate as a representative of an agency, it comes with whatever impression they have about the agency. Sometimes it's not good. And sometimes people, there's a lack of trust and all kinds of issues that I know that you deal with. When somebody else, somebody from the public sends it to all of their friends and say, hey, you should do this, or shares it on Facebook, that comes with their credibility and their relationships, and it makes it all the difference in the world. And it basically, if you're not getting people to share it, it can't go viral. It's as simple as that. And so think of how many times you've seen a long, boring kind of text-based survey, advertised on anybody's Facebook page. It just doesn't happen. So it's important to think about what kind of things would I be excited to share with my contacts that I know that they would like or retweet or whatever it is. Another part of diversity is making sure that your platform, whatever you're using, is able to reliably collect demographic information on who's being engaged. And here's some results from a recent process in Los Angeles, actually, where they engaged perfectly the actual demographics of the Los Angeles area. And I'll tell you in a sec how they did that. But look at here. This was a bus study that was being done for Los Angeles. The biggest share of participants was under $50,000 household income. A perfect representation of the demographics of Los Angeles, all age groups involved, of course, a gender balance, and they even dove into each zip code to make sure that they had good coverage throughout the region. They did it primarily by creating a delightful online experience that was fast, fun, and easy, and B, promoting it strategically. And really, part of the big lesson here is saving your effort around promotion for halfway through your process, where you can identify where the gaps are and where you'd like to fill in some of those gaps, and then target your promotional efforts to those gaps. So just as a result of that particular case study, it took me 2 minutes on Facebook, on the advertising platform on the back of Facebook, to create a little pretend audience of what I would think to be a difficult to reach audience for that particular project in Los Angeles. So here is an audience of people that I could send an advertisement about the project to in Los Angeles. These are people on Facebook that are over the age of 60, that are women, who are Hispanic who have an interest in public transit. And you would think that that would be a really fairly narrow cross-section of the population. It's an important demographic for this study. It's 54,000 people. And so if you send an ad to these 54,000 people, you're going to increase your participation of Hispanics that are interested in transit, that are women over the age of 60. So that's how you can target very specifically demographics using something like a Facebook advertising platform. There's also a lot of value and return on investment for creating something that I like to call a share kit, which is essentially a document that you can share with local bloggers or the leaders of community groups that may represent a difficult to reach community, which is just an easy way for them to cut and paste graphics, a little blurb, a small, medium, and large blurb that they can put directly in their blog or post on social networks that has the link to what you want people to do and a call to action. They are free to edit a little bit and send it out to their community. It's so important to be engaging one-on-one with these leaders, because when their call to action goes out to their trusted network, they're always looking for content, but your content comes with it, and their trust carries it forward. It's so important when you're targeting to find these groups and pick up the phone and give them some resources that make it easy. Even if they're feeling lazy that day, they can crank out a blog post because you've written it for them, you've given them some graphics, and they can just cut and paste, edit a few words, put a byline in, and send it off. Once again, these are some of the tactics that I've documented in this guidebook, which I can send you. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about, and this is where I'll show a little bit about the MetroQuest platform, because I know that many of you might be curious. Informed input is so important, because we're dealing as planners with fairly complex issues that involve some complexity around things like trade-offs and constraints and choices that the public really doesn't spend their time thinking about. And when we only have a budget of about 5 minutes, we have found with MetroQuest anyway, that it's important to gamify education around planning in a way that you're collecting people's opinions, but at the same time, you're educating them about the choices, constraints, and trade-offs. So for example, something like a coin game goes a long way to helping people appreciate that there's constraints and limitations. Looking at different scenarios of the future is important to communicate that there's options and pros and cons of any particular direction. So it sort of encases education in something that feels a little bit like a game, but it only takes about 90 seconds to play. But when people put their opinions in, they're more informed than they would be otherwise. Or things like balancing the budget, and you can imagine all of the games. And I'll show you some examples now from some examples that I've chosen that I think demonstrate some of these issues that I'm talking about comprehensively, but also for those of you who are interested, shows you a little bit more about MetroQuest so you can get an idea about what it is and how it works. So I've chosen here 5 examples of MetroQuest surveys that have been created in New York that I think exemplify many of the points that I've made already about best practices. So this is sort of a combination of making good choices as a user of the tool, to make choices to keep it visual, to keep it fast and fun, but also to educate people about choices along the way. So let's get at it. So this, the first 2 here are from the MTC in New York City. So this first one is a safety and security study that they were doing for all 10 counties that MTC covers. The welcome screen here on the survey gives people a few nuggets of information. You can pick your language and begin right away. You don't want to take too much time welcoming people. It's just something very colorful and inviting, and encourage people to begin. The first real interactive experience that they created, they used the coin game in MetroQuest to have people to evaluate which priority areas they see as being top priority for improving the transit system in New York. And you can see that as I do this, I'm going to run out of coins. And that's really the point. You're trying to educate people that there are trade-offs and constraints along the way, that there's a lot of priority areas, and at the same time collect people's opinions about what are their top priorities. The next is a priority ranking screen that really educates people very nicely about all of the safety and security issues around the transit system that exist, and having them weigh in on which ones they feel are their top priorities. But it also does a great job of helping people kind of scope, here are the things that we're playing with in this planning process. And here are the things that are important. So you can go in here and talk about your top priorities, make comments, but really what you're doing is you're doing a fairly sophisticated task here, which is rank ordering these priorities and learning about the scope of the project. The next screen, I love this one. It's called in MetroQuest, is called the trade-off screen, specifically designed for planners to help people understand that every choice involves some trade-offs. So here we're asking people, do you want tighter security, or do you want to focus on ease of movement? There's a trade-off there. If we have tighter security, it's going to come at the cost of ease of movement. Where would you put yourself on this spectrum is an important question that once you put it into the community's hands, they start to have a little bit more empathy for what you're dealing with as an agency. There's all kinds of trade-offs here. I'm not going to go into them all, but is it important from a technology perspective of sharing data or personal security? So there's a trade-off. We can have more security, but that will mean less data that we have to use to improve the system, and all kinds of other ones. Walking and biking versus other road uses. You can imagine all kinds of trade-offs in play here. And then the last screen collects people's demographic information so we can know who we're hearing from. Interestingly, once you've engaged people for a few minutes, they will be happy to provide this information. The vast majority do. And then you can know, who you're hearing from, who you might be missing, so you can make those adjustments in your process along the way for prioritizing those communities. The next one here that some of you may have seen, MetroQuest was used on a bus network redesign for each of the boroughs in New York City. I like this one because it goes right into the specific improvements that are being considered in each of the lines, and ask people to make comments about which ones they prefer. And you can, if you want, when you're setting this up, you can keep people within a particular budget, so they can kind of spend money and make improvements along the way. The next one is kind of open-ended. Tell us what you think about where new lines need to be, where routes need to be changed, where anything, where a bus stop. Maybe there's a bus shelter that might be missing. Where you can nominate different areas for any of these issues along the way. And the next one here is right across the state in the city of Syracuse and the town of DeWitt, elevating Erie, which is a corridor along Erie Boulevard. I thought this one was exemplary because very, very quick, very colorful. They ask people a few quick questions. And this is, I think, one of the best examples of a visual preference survey where you're using some graphics to engage people on what people like in terms of design characteristics that they might prefer along this corridor. So you can go for each of these, and you can weigh in and rate it on a scale of 1 to 5. And I thought that was a great example of how to use a visual preference survey. This next one and the Erie Harbor public enhancements project, I thought was another great example of a visual preference survey that actually uses real images. And let's face it, not a lot of people are walking around thinking about, wayfinding and safety or active recreation designs. But it's important when you're in the planning process to give people a range of choices and ask them to weigh in so they feel like they have a role to play in the design of whether it's the character of the landscape, and whether there's natural vegetation, all kinds of issues where people can very quickly navigate around these choices and have their say. And the last one here was a process in Rochester called the Reimagine RTS. I thought this was a great example where they first asked people to rank their priorities. So here we can figure out what we want in terms of the transit system in Rochester. And once you've picked your top priorities there, then you can move down to the scenario ranking screen and you can see both the pros and cons. So these are my top priorities, and this one does really well on 2 of my 3 top priorities, but there is a trade-off to be had. This one does poorly on 2 of the 3 top priorities. So you can see how you can educate people about pros and cons in a matter of about 90 seconds and get their opinion on which one they prefer. They can learn a lot about the pros and cons of these. And then opening it right up, they can talk about challenges and successes with different parts of the city, so they can actually dot up the map for different areas. So seeing where issues cluster, where problems might be. So I thought that was a great example of how gamifying is possible to educate people in a very, very short period of time, usually 60 seconds or 90 seconds per activity, but also collecting their input on what they think at the end of that little learning experience. The last aspect that I'll mention very briefly is about quantifying the results. It's so important because most of these surveys do tend to go viral. They are quite popular. People will share them with their community. And so you can expect in many cases 10 or 20,000 pieces of data flying at you, many times more often. And so dealing with all of that data, it's so important to be able to quantify it in a way that makes sense. And so with respect to MetroQuest anyways, these templates have been optimized around collecting quantifiable input, but also inviting people to make comments in addition to them. So for example, you can talk about how you wanted to rate images or scenarios, but you can also make comments of why you like things when you do. And so that will help you dive into, for example, the things that were rated poorly. You can dive into the comments. You only need to read 10 or 15 of them to understand why people didn't like a particular concept. Similarly, for the concepts that are very popular, you only have to read 10 or 15 to see the patterns of why people really like a particular alternative. It's so important because going through 20,000 comments is nobody's idea of a good time. Even when it comes to map-based inputs, it's important to give people, as you saw when I was dragging the comments on a map, I could use the drop-down box to categorize what the nature of my comment is, whether it's a safety concern or so forth, that you can then, in the results back end of your online engagement tool, you can categorize. So, let's look at all of the safety related comments for a particular study area. And when you see 400 comments around a particular intersection or a community around safety, it's very clear that there's an issue around there. And once again, you only need to look at about 10 or 15 different comments to see why people are making those conclusions around that particular area. So all of these strategies are really designed to enhance the presentation back to decision makers about the results. One of the things that I did recently, just because I was like, after developing the online engagement platform, I really wanted to go back to the users and ask them questions about, is it making a difference? What difference is it making? How has it changed things that you're doing? So the last National Planning Conference of the APA, I took 2 days and I chased down as many clients as I could, and I got them into a corner and I said, would you mind answering a few questions? And the last question I asked them all was the kind of why bother? What difference did it make to what you were doing? And this speaks not only to obviously MetroQuest, but any effort that you've taken to engage the community very broadly and been successful at. What difference does that make? Why would you spend that effort? And so the question, what difference did it make? Almost to a T. I interviewed on that, I think I got to 12 different people. They all said some version of the same thing. They all said something like, it gave courage to the elected officials or the decision makers. They worded it differently, but almost all of them used the word courage. And I thought that was so interesting. So once the camera was turned off, I asked them, so what do you mean by courage? And really what they were talking about is when you're changing or proposing to change the course of your community, or making a brave, bold choice to do something different in your community, obviously that takes courage, political courage. It takes decision maker courage to make a really dramatic change in the community. And that is only possible when you have the data to back it up from the community, that it's going to be well received and a positive change, and people are going to be willing to make the trade-offs that are required in order to get the benefits out at the end. So I thought that was so telling, and it really, you can't believe how reassuring it was to me to know that some of the things that we're doing were making a difference, because when I could talk to people that were actually making bold choices and having them approved and having the community behind them, that's really why I do what I do. And when I talked to one of them, she shared this graphic with me. She said, one of the most important things that we did, they ended up engaging in this process 25,000 people in the community. They went back to those people that they engaged, and they shared graphics of what they heard from the community. So as opposed to putting the results of the public engagement on page 115 in Appendix J, they created graphics and shared them widely on social media and all other avenues to help what they called build a culture of engagement. I thought that was so important. There was a level of apathy in their community, and they really wanted to reward people for participating. So they made sure that people knew that the people who had participated changed the outcome. They made a difference, that they actually made policy changes and planning strategy changes based on the public input. And if you're thinking about building or rebuilding a culture of engagement and kind of trust with the community, there's nothing better than rewarding people by saying you made a difference. And I think that is probably one of the most important steps to finish with, is make sure that at the end of it, when you have engaged broadly, that you let people know that they did make a difference and that you changed the outcome as a result of what you heard from them. And that, kind of to summarize, is what I've learned over the years, bruises and all, about the recipe for what I call actionable results. And so it's a great pleasure now to open it up. We've got 16 minutes for questions. There again is my email address if you would like any of the resources that I've mentioned. I've got webinar recordings that I could send you on topics around diversity. I've got guidebooks and so forth. But right now, let's take some questions from the audience. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dave. Just before we jump into questions, just like to take a moment again to thank Dave for presenting to the group and continuing to be part of what's been a very successful conference. I'd like to give everyone a moment at a time to review the CM credit number that's been put in the chat. The CM credit number is 920-5108, and that is in our webinar chat box. We also have our Q&A box, which is where looks like 2 of our questions will come from. So I will turn it back over to Dave and have the questions be answered live. Right before that, again, our sponsor is Ingalls Planning and Design. And we thank them again for giving us a platform to have Dave really enlighten us all. So Dave, please take it away and I'll be on your support.
Okay, so the first question, how do we represent the silent majority who may support a project, but they themselves are not advocates? Whenever we talk about innovative transportation projects in my municipality, i.e. bike lanes, the lack of a groundswell of support is often cited, even though roughly 70% of residents surveyed approved of installing bike lanes. We seem to only get the conversation started when enough people become self-motivated advocates. Great question. So a lot of what I've talked about in this presentation is about trying to get people that normally don't participate. Let me just tell one quick story about a bike planning process that I was involved with, and in the past in this community, they had run several bike lane enhancement processes, and they found in every other process that they developed, they found that they had exactly the right infrastructure, and that the community just wanted more of the same infrastructure. And when they engaged much more broadly than that, they used MetroQuest, but they also used kiosks, and they made the library home screen the survey. They used paper-based surveys, a lot of strategies to get out beyond the usual suspects. They started getting very, very different information about what people wanted or needed with respect to bike lanes. And they thought, where are these ideas coming from that people were like completely contradicting previous planning studies? And so we analyzed what was going on. And it turns out that in previous planning studies, they were engaging cyclists, which on the face of it seems logical. Of course, you want to engage the cycling community, but cyclists by definition are happy with the cycling conditions right now. 60% of the population identify themselves as would-be cyclists if there were changes that made them feel more comfortable. That was the opportunity that existed in the community, but they weren't involved in the process because they didn't see themselves as being cyclists, so they weren't engaged. When we went beyond the usual suspects to engage what I would consider to be the silent majority, they discovered that they did not have the right infrastructure, that people did not feel comfortable sharing a roadway with cars going so quickly. They, in this particular community, they also had train tracks running down the road, which made it very, very uncomfortable for a lot of cyclists. So there was a lot of reasons that people were talking about having completely different, more separated bike lanes and infrastructure, but they weren't involved in the process. So I think the how do you engage the silent majority? It takes the right digital experiences I've talked about, but it also takes a real way of engaging people in a way that they feel that is comfortable, but also that they feel like they know that you want to hear from them, even if they don't identify as being, in this case, cyclists, or in a lot of cases, experts. it's so, when we interview people about why they don't participate in something, one of the most frequently mentioned things is, well, I'm not an expert in that area. I'll let somebody else weigh in. I just don't know much about that. And it's such a shame that people feel like they don't have an expertise on their own priorities and opinions. But there's subtle things that are presented in a way that seems intimidating for people that don't have expertise. So it's so important to be open and welcoming to people, and make it seem like you don't need expertise in order to participate. We've got a few more questions in. The next one, many of these concepts are great for larger agencies, larger projects, and larger budgets. Any tips for soliciting input on a municipal comprehensive plan for a rural municipality of 1,100 people with spotty cell coverage and internet access and internet access and a very limited project budget? So a great question, and fair point. Generally speaking, something like MetroQuest, the cutoff point would be, a municipality of maybe 20,000 people or 30,000 people. Smaller municipalities generally don't have the time or budget to manage something like that. So I would say the quick solution is, it's very difficult during COVID. I've got to say that we're very limited, and it's important to be able to engage people in a safe way. And so without internet access, it is very, very tricky. I would suggest that using things like paper-based surveys. There's almost always in a small community, there's a community center, general stores, and these sort of things which are common points where people collect, putting, quick postcards and that sort of thing, having an alternative. So you could have like a Survey Monkey, quick survey on Survey Monkey for people that want to participate that way. There's some ideas for you, but it is, during COVID, is very, very difficult, because in a smaller community, it's somewhat more reasonable to get people to gather. And it's difficult in a rural municipality because oftentimes there isn't that common gathering space. So next question here. Your project examples are great. However, many of them are larger communities, similar, larger communities that I assume have healthy budgets. What are your recommendations to implement these? Well, very similar to the last question. And what would you prioritize, and/or are there some basic outreach tools that could be augmented? So very similar to the last question. Paper-based surveys are great. Postcards are wonderful. Bookmarks. One thing that we have found work extremely well is in communities where there is limited internet access, using library computers as a resource. And so in one process, we made the home screen of the library the survey. And so when people sat down to use the library computer, the survey popped up and engaged. In that case, we ended up engaging 25% of a community that was 20,000 people. So the entire community of 20,000 people, 25% of them were engaged using some strategies like that. We had paper-based options as well, but most people engaged online, either through the library computer or on their own devices. These days, increasingly, you will find about 90% of people do have internet access, not necessarily at home, but on a smartphone. And that's why I stressed having a delightful experience on smartphones, even in rural communities. Somewhere between 85 and 90% of people will have connectivity on a smartphone. And that's in many cases how they only access the internet. Great question here. How do you make a paper-based survey fun? Well, oftentimes what our clients have done is they have used the graphics in the interface and basically cut and pasted it into a PDF document. And so people are looking at exactly the same thing that they would be looking at online. It's important to make the experiences similar enough because when the results come in, you want to be confident that the information isn't being skewed by somebody being given it, in text only format without the visuals that somebody else was using online. And so we found that, and again, by making sure that the entire experience is about 5 minutes online, it ends up being just a 2 or 3 page, very, very fast survey that you can do in a few minutes. And so there's nothing more fun than not being asked for very much time and showing people lots of color and lots of visuals. Another question here, is there a recommendation for best practices for a good time to hold a live public meeting virtually to get the most attendance? Great question. So now there are differences between communities depending on what the pattern of the community is, but generally speaking, you can get the most attendance. Well, you get different attendance. You can get what I would consider to be stakeholders, people who are involved with different agencies or different community groups to participate during the day. But the public is not going to be participating during the day. So if you're talking about public engagement, you said here a live public meeting, then early evening would likely be best. Friday nights are out, Monday nights are out. I would say Tuesday or Wednesday night would probably be preferable, and usually in the 6:30 to 7 o'clock time frame, and try to keep it so you're wrapped up by 8:30 or so. Try to keep it so people can get home and tuck their kids in and so forth. It's possible if you're running a longer workshop, oftentimes 10 o'clock on Saturday morning becomes a good option. Stay away from Sundays. And so those are my suggestions for virtual meetings. Virtual meetings are a great idea now because there's so many people that are comfortable with them in a way that they haven't been since COVID hit. People are, that's how they're meeting most people these days. And so the level of tolerance for public meetings virtually has gone way, way up. At the same time, you're also dealing with overload where people are feeling like, oh, not another Zoom meeting. And so we found that alternating between a quick survey and a virtual meeting, you can get dialogue happening in a virtual meeting that maybe is a little bit richer than you could do in a static survey. But if you want to get lots of people to weigh in on your planning options, there's probably nothing more effective than a quick survey. And with that, we have come to the top of the hour, and we have no open questions. So everything seems to be working out. Is there any wrap-up comments that the organizers would like to make?
Yes, thank you, Dave. It's really been a pleasure to have you here as part of our conference and get your insight. Thank you for taking the time to answer questions as well. It was a robust conversation. Thank you to all the participants. We encourage you to continue attending the conference as we come to a close during what has been an unprecedented time. We also thank again our sponsors, Ingalls Planning and Design, for continuing to provide the space for Dave to provide his expertise. And we hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference as much or more than you've enjoyed it so far. Thank you for your time, and we'll end for today.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Take care.